Okay, test, good. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So we're in Daniel 12, which is the last chapter of Daniel. Hopefully we'll finish this up tonight. I don't see Steve in here, but he taught last week. I was going to say thank you to him for filling in last week for me. So Daniel 12, it continues with a vision that's been going on for several chapters up to this point. So just one or two things to kind of mention again, just so we're kind of on the same page. A lot of what chapter 11 was about the Antichrist coming. It goes by some different names in chapter 11, but it's the same individual you see when you get to the New Testament, particularly in Revelation, and Paul talks about him in Thessalonian letter as well. So the Antichrist, we'll just call it that to make it simple. Some people argue that it's a single individual or a group of individuals, and the last time I taught, I just mentioned that a popular interpretation of chapter 11, at least a popular Protestant interpretation of it, is that the Antichrist refers to the papacy, the Roman papacy. I'm not telling you to believe that, but that is a common interpretation of what Daniel chapter 11 is talking about. And so when you keep that in mind, that kind of carries over into chapter 12, so it's something to kind of remember as we're talking about this. So we'll finish up chapter 12 tonight. So it starts off, and so the vision keeps going into the first part of the chapter, and then the vision will come to an end, kind of in the middle of the chapter. So it says, at that time, and the time that it's referring to is the time of the Antichrist. So the things that he's talking about at this point of the vision are all things off in the future from Daniel's perspective. Now, we're kind of in that age now. So the age of the Antichrist, and it'll get more into this in a minute, but I'll go ahead and kind of mention it. Most people think, particularly if you hold to the view that the papacy is the Antichrist, then most people view it as the Antichrist has always been there since Christ was here, or since Christ was resurrected and the church started. But the Antichrist was hidden for a period of time. He's there, but he's not out in the open. And then later on, several centuries later, he becomes more visible and more obvious. And the people that hold to that view, they generally assume that the Caesars are the first kind of a line of the Antichrist. And as the Roman Empire declines, the Catholic Church rises in power. And so you're basically making an assumption that as the Caesars decline, the power of the Caesars really gets redistributed to what becomes the papacy over time. And so that whole line of Caesar to then papacy is really kind of what the Antichrist is, if you hold to that theory or line of reasoning. And so it's going to talk about a little bit of that in this chapter, so I kind of want to explain that again on the front end. All right, so when you look at the first verse of verse 12, it says, at that time, again, the time of the Antichrist, this time off in the future, from Daniel's perspective, but it's a time that we're living in now. So it says, Michael shall stand up. Now remember, he mentioned Michael a couple chapters back. Michael's the archangel that is, during the time of Daniel and going forward, he is the one who fights for God's people. At that time, obviously, the Jews, the Jewish nation. What Michael does now, is he fighting for Christians? Doesn't quite say, but at the time that he's writing, he was in charge of protecting and fighting for the Jewish people. So it says, at that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. So that seems to indicate that Michael is still the archangel over God's people. So now it would be the Christian age that he's referring to. And so Michael may be still the one as the lead archangel over God's people in that sense. And it says, and there shall be a time of trouble. And that phrase, that time of trouble phrase, is used a bunch of times in the Old Testament. It's also used a bunch of times in the New Testament. And Christ uses this phrase several times as well to talk about a time of trouble that's going to come upon God's people. And so it says, such as never was, since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered. And so what this is a message of hope that despite how bad the trouble may come over time, God's people will always be delivered by God. Okay, and that's the gist of what he's talking about here. And then it says, everyone who is found written in the book of life. Sorry, the book. It doesn't say book of life, but it is referring to the book of life. So that's what that's talking about. So it's a similar thing that you see in the book of Revelation. The idea is that God's people will always be delivered and their names are written in the book of life. Now that doesn't mean they'll be without trouble in this life. In fact, he just says there's going to be a time when there is great trouble. But out of the situation of trouble, God's people will still be delivered. Now, that doesn't mean they'll be delivered physically in this life. We may suffer persecution or even death, but spiritually we will be delivered. Eternally we'll be delivered. All right, verse 2, it says, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. This is the greatest single verse from the Old Testament that there is an afterlife. So the vision here to Daniel specifically says that some people will be raised to everlasting life after they die, some to shame and contempt. So it kind of makes you wonder, how did the Sadducees in the New Testament not believe in an afterlife? Because this verse clearly points to that. But the point in the context here is that God's people will be delivered. If your name is in the book of life, you will be delivered. And you'll be delivered to an everlasting life, as opposed to those whose names are not written in the book of life. They will be raised to a life of shame and contempt. And then verse 3, it says, those who are wise shall shine. Wise there meaning faithful. Those who are faithful to God shall shine like the brightness of the firmament. And this is the same idea that it mentioned a few chapters back when it talked about Christ shining. And so the idea is that if you're a Christian, because remember this is all referring to the Christian age, so this is a vision off in the future from Daniel's time, but it's referring to the time of the Antichrist. So he's saying that in the Christian age, God's people will shine with brightness like Christ shines with brightness. And those who turn many to righteous like the stars forever and ever. So it says those who turn many to righteous means the Christians will spread the gospel, convert other people to Christianity. And then it says, as a result, there will be stars forever and ever, which harkens back to the promise made to Abraham that his seed and his descendants will be like the stars of the sky. So all this is a message of hope for these events in the future, that during this time of the Antichrist, despite all the trouble, despite all the trials, persecution, and so forth, God's people, if they're faithful and faithful to the end, their names will be written in the book of life. They will be resurrected to an everlasting life with him, and that there will be a numerous people that will shine like the stars in the sky. So this is all a message of hope, and it's very similar and reminiscent to what you see in the book of Revelation. All right, so that's not the end of the vision, but it's kind of the end of the vision-ish type speech. The rest of this is a little more plain language. All right, so verse 4, it says, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. So God is now saying to Daniel, or actually this is Christ talking, but Christ saying to Daniel, okay, shut up the book. So, he was reading this on a scroll. He says, shut it up until the time of the end. So in other words, what does that mean? That means there's not going to be any more revelation. So he's been seeing this vision now for multiple chapters, And the one speaking to him, who is presumably Christ, says, okay, that's the end of the vision. I'm not going to tell you any more about the vision. Okay, so that's what that means. And he tells him to seal it up. But the interesting thing is when you get to Revelation, it says the opposite, which is it becomes unsealed at that point. Okay, so Daniel has to seal it because there's not supposed to be any more revelation for a period of time about these specific events. But when you get to the time of John, Christ tells John the opposite, which is to open it, because Christ breaks the seal and allows more information to be revealed. Okay, it says, and the seal of the book until the time of the end, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. And that just means that in the future, when this Christian age comes about, more information will be revealed, which we know that John received more information and more revelation. And so that's what that's alluding to, is that there will be more information coming in the future. But for Daniel and this period of time, this is where it stops. All right, so verse 5, it says, then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others, and these are presumably angels, one on this riverbank and the other on that riverbank. The river is presumably the Tigris River, because that would be flowing through the area that he's located when he's getting this vision. All right, so it says, and one said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, excuse me, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? So you've got four individuals here. You got Daniel, you got an angel on one side of the river, an angel on the other side of the river, and then a guy floating above the water, above the river. So the two on the river banks are presumably angels, and the one in between floating above the water is presumably Christ, which is the one who's been talking this whole time. So what's happening is one of the angels turns to what we assume is Christ, and he asks this question. And the question is, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? The word wonders is referring back to something mentioned a chapter or two ago, which is the things that the Antichrist does. So when you go back and you look, the Antichrist is going to, basically say a bunch of false things that sound true, but they're actually false, and they lead people away from Christ. And so the angel is asking him, okay, if that is the case, how long is this going to last for? Or how long are you going to let this last, basically? In other words, how long is the Antichrist going to be allowed to do the things that he does? That's the idea. All right, so verse 7, it says, then I heard the man clothed in linen, which is Christ, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever. Sorry. This is a reference. So when he holds up his right hand to make an oath, this is a reference back to Deuteronomy. So in Deuteronomy, it mentions that God will fight for his people, and he makes an oath that he will do so. But in Deuteronomy, he raises one hand to make the oath. Here he's actually raising both, okay? And so that basically is a way of, I guess you could say, it'd be like putting exclamation points after a statement. So instead of just raising one hand, he raises both hands to kind of reiterate how much he's going to promise to do what he's about to say, okay? So it says, it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. So this is where it's going to get into some numbers and stuff that gets a little confusing. I'll try to kind of make it simple as possible here. All right, so the time, times, and half a time, that is numerology. So time is 1, times is 2, and half a time is 0.5. Okay, so if you add 1 plus 2 plus 0.5, you get 3.5. 3.5 is half of 7. 7 is the perfect number in numerology in Jewish culture. If you go back, obviously, to creation, 7 is the time it took for creation, and on the seventh day God rested. And so 7 represents the perfect number, or a period of completeness, basically. Whereas 3.5 is half of that, so it's It's an incomplete time, basically, is what it is, okay? So he's saying that it's going to last for a finite period of time. It's going to be kind of an incomplete period of time that this stuff will happen. It's the same number scheme that he used a couple chapters back. So if you remember back, I think it's chapter 7, when he talked about the little horn. The little horn is also the Antichrist. And he says the same thing back then, that it'll be times, and half a time. So he's used this same idea before in the book, okay? So it's going to be for a finite, or for a period of time, as opposed to a complete period of time, okay? All right, so I know that doesn't mean a whole lot, but anyway. All right, so verse 8, it says, although I heard, I did not understand. So if you're confused, so was Daniel, so don't feel bad. So then Daniel says, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? All right, so you to understand what Daniel's asking, remember, he's hearing a prophecy about something that's off in the future. He doesn't understand all of it. Obviously, he doesn't know anything about Jesus and Jesus coming and Jesus establishing the church and all this stuff. But he knows some prophecies that refer to these things, and he's getting this additional prophecy to talk about all this stuff. And so he's asking this question. He wants to know more information. Okay, so he's basically saying, can you tell me anything more about this 3.5? About how long the Antichrist will be allowed to do this, and when the end of his work will come to an end. So that's really the question he's asking. Can you give me any more information about the Antichrist, what he's going to do to the church, and when his role will come to an end? And this is Christ's answer, verse 9. He said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So he basically says, no, I'm not going to tell you anything more right now. And then he says, many shall be purified, made white, and refined. And so these are 3 verbs talking about what's going to happen to God's people during this age. So during the Christian age, God's people will be purified, made white, and refined. Okay, and those are things that were previously said about Christ in one of the earlier visions. Okay, so in that sense, Christians will be like Christ in that we're purified, we're made white, we're refined, and so forth. And all that is really, a lot of it is as a result of the trials and the persecution and things that we have to endure. But it says, but the wicked shall do wickedly. So on the one hand, you have God's people. On the other hand, you have the wicked people. And it says, the wicked will do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So this is kind of an enlightening statement. Why do the wicked people do wicked things? It's because they don't understand. And specifically, what do they not understand? They don't understand the gospel message, okay? So if someone understands the gospel and really understands it, generally they'll respond to it. It's when you don't understand it that you rebel against it, okay? And so it's our responsibility as Christians to help them understand it. But when they don't understand it, they're going to do wicked things, and wicked things are going to include persecuting God's people, okay? And so that's what he's referencing here. So he's saying, I'm not going to tell you anything more about how long the Antichrist is going to be around, or exactly what he's going to do, or when his job will come to the end. But I will tell you a little bit about the Christians will be purified, made white, and refined, and the wicked people will do wicked things. All right, verse 11, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and this is where it gets confusing with the numbers, and I'll try to explain the numbers. Bottom line is the numbers aren't literal, and we've seen some of these numbers already, but I'll try to explain what he's doing here. All right, it says that from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken up and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,190 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. All right, let me try to explain this. All right, so a couple things is happening here. One thing he's doing, so trying to think of where to start with this explanation. If you don't have to do this, but if you flipped over to Revelation, so what we have here are two numbers. We have the number 1290 and the number 1335. Okay, if you flip over to Revelation, it gives you a number of 1260. Okay. So here we have 1290, Revelation has 1260. What does this mean? Well, back up, how many days are in 3.5 years? Because remember he talked about the 3.5 a second ago. Well, in our calendar, 3.5 is 1,278 days, okay? And he's using 1290. Does it make any difference that there's a discrepancy? No, because it's not literal anyway. But what is he doing? Well, the 1260 that you see in Revelation, that's based off of an average 30-day month. So if you assume all the months are 30 days, then 30-month days, if you take 42 of those, you get 1260, okay? So 42 months is 3.5 years. 3.5 years at 30 days a month is 1260, okay? He's using the number 1290. It's close enough, all right? So it's not meant to be exactly exact. So he's playing off the idea of 3.5, all right? That's really what's going on. Okay, but John is going to do the same thing through the vision he receives in Revelation when he uses 1260 instead of 1290, all right? All right, so that's where the 1290 comes from. The 1335 is a little different. So same idea, but a little different. So let me tell you what the days are. So when you look at verse 11, he's talking about a time from when the daily sacrifice is taken away. That's when he's talking about the time from Antiochus IV to some particular time, okay? So the 1290 is the time from Antiochus IV to the return of Christ, all right? When is Christ returning? We don't know, all right? But anyway, he's using Antiochus IV as the starting point, and going forward to the end of time is going to be 1,290 days, all right? The second number, the 1335, if you read that as verse 12, it says, "Blessed is he who waits." The he there is Daniel, okay? And so in that one, he is, instead of starting at Antiochus IV, he's backing up in time and starting from Daniel and going forward to the end of time, okay? All right, so hopefully you're not confused. So the 1335 is Daniel till the end of time. The 1290 is from Antiochus IV to the end of time, all right? So what's the difference in 1290 and 1335? That's 45 days, okay? So 45 days represents the time from Daniel to Antiochus IV, all right? And that's all the numbers really are, okay? Now, if you want to play around with this out of curiosity, if you take the number of, so if 45 days is the time between Daniel and Antiochus IV, a day would represent how many years, if you had to guess? I did the math earlier. Let me think about this for a second. It worked out to about 8 years was a day, okay? And if you take the other number, which is the time from Antiochus to the time of Jesus' birth, which would be that difference in 1290 that we see here and the 1260 that you see in Revelation, that would be about an average of about 5 years per day, okay? So you can see that the two don't even match up. One is 8 years, the other is 5 years. They're not intended to be literal. But if you played around with the numbers out of curiosity, if you went with the 8 years per day strategy, when would Christ return? It'd be around 10,000 AD. And if you went with the 5 year per day strategy, Christ would return around 6,000 AD. right? Uh, I'm not suggesting either one of them are literal, but it kind of makes you chuckle and laugh when you think about it, because how many people do you hear that say, "Oh, the end has got to be right around the door"? I mean, we're right at the end because of all the events that are happening and all that, as if these events haven't been happening for 2,000 years, right? So if you kind of think about it that way, do we really have 4 to 8,000 more years to go? I have no idea. But it kind of does kind of make you stop and reflect. Okay, this isn't literal. Don't take it literal. It's just supposed to represent a period of time. Okay. But it also kind of may give you a little context in, yeah, there's a lot of craziness going on right now, but there's always craziness going on, okay? And really the message of all this is not the craziness that's going on or trying to figure out when Christ returns. It's what you see in the first 3 verses, which is despite all the craziness, God will take care of his people. God will resurrect his people to eternal life with him. Okay, that's the message. So it's really a message of hope, not a message of let's figure out some dates and random stuff and when Christ might return and all this stuff. That's really not what any of this is about. All right, so we're to the last verse here, verse 13. But you, so this is Christ talking to Daniel, go on your way till the end, for you shall rest, and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. So what is Christ saying to Daniel here? So he says, but you go your way till the end. In other words, keep living for God till your end. But he says, for you shall rest. Rest there is a euphemism for death. He's saying you're not going to see any of this come to fruition. You're going to die before any of these events take place. So all this stuff that Daniel saw in this vision that lasted multiple chapters, Jesus is telling him you're not going to see any of this come to fruition. So it says, you will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. So in other words, he's promising him that he's going to be resurrected like he's talking about in the first 3 verses, that because you're faithful, you will be resurrected to life eternally with God. Okay. So in other words, what he's telling him, what we would call in the New Testament, is you're a saint, and you will live with God forever. Okay. But what also is his inheritance? So when you kind of piece the book together and everything that he's been talking about, let me tell you a few of the things that Daniel will be promised as his inheritance. So if you go back and look in chapter 1 and also in chapter 9, he will have insight. If you look at chapter 12, verse 2, he will be resurrected on the last day. Chapter 12, verse 3, he will shine like the brightness of the sky and be like the stars forever. So those are just a few of the things that he will inherit, okay? And Paul says some of the same stuff about saints in Colossians 1, verse 12. And it says that he will receive this at the end of days, which is what it says here, just like all the saints that Paul mentions in Titus 2, verse 13. So Daniel is being compared to the saints that we see in the New Testament. So all this is a message of hope. All the things that he's talking about here in chapter 12 are in the Christian age, but they're saints in the Old Testament, and they have the same promises, okay? And Daniel is being told that he's going to receive the same thing as these people in the future that he's so curious about, but he's not allowed to learn any more information about. That's the end of the book. I have a few kind of closing thoughts, but I'll stop for a second and see if anybody has any questions, comments, or anything you want to say about the book. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so the abomination of desolation is just another term for the Antichrist. Yeah. Or at least that's a popular view of it, at least. Yeah. So, any other comments or questions? Do you have your hand up, Sandy? I couldn't tell. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. True. Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else? Sorry, I think, did somebody's hand pop up over? No, okay. All right, so I was just going to mention a couple things kind of as we wrap the book up here. So what we've seen with Daniel, we started off in the first chapter and we see him as probably a teenager when he's first taken from captivity, from Jerusalem in captivity to Babylon. So we see him at a very early age. Probably his parents were killed. He, like we talked about at the beginning of the book, he may have been of the royal family or at least of a very influential family based on the fact that Babylonians took him, decided to educate him, and so forth. So he's been taken as probably a teenager out of a probably affluent situation in Jerusalem to captivity in Babylon. And so we see him from that stage, and then we see him at multiple different phases in his life, different times and ages in his life. And here at the end of the book, we see him at the very end of his life. He's probably in his mid-80s at this point. And so we see him from all the way from a teenager to probably a mid-80-ish year old man. And so we see potentially a 70-year stretch of time of his life. And it's encapsulated in 12 chapters here in the book. Can you think of any other person in the Bible that has this much recorded about that individual and not a negative thing is said about him? I can think of one, but other than that one, can you think of a single individual that you can't find anything negative about? Can you think of any prophet that has more than a few verses written about them that you can't say anything negative about? And so in that regard, Daniel is fairly unique, okay? Now, you might say, well, he's writing it himself. Maybe he chose to leave out the times he messed up. And maybe that's the case. But I think it's pretty interesting that he gets these promises directly from Jesus in chapter 12 about the things that he's going to inherit, about the fact that he's going to live with God forever. And you have to ask yourself, is that all based upon the fact, not all based upon the fact, but is the fact that he lived such a righteous life in such a negative environment that contributed to the promises that he was given. Okay, now obviously we know we're saved by grace, not by our works, but as you kind of think about that, and what does that mean for our life? Does that mean you can do whatever you want? Or is the book of Daniel a book partially about what the picture of a righteous person actually looks like? And if you think that that is partly what the book is about seeing somebody who's always righteous, despite the fact he has so many people who want to see him fall because of his political status and the level of success he had in both the Babylonian government and the Persian government. People were jealous of him. People wanted him to die or to have his prosperity taken for him. And he always did what was right in God's eyes, not in what other people wanted him to do. And so as you look at the book, yes, there's a lot of things in it, and there's a lot of motifs and themes and so forth, but maybe for us, maybe that's a theme that we can kind of focus on, is that no matter the situation you're in, this is what righteousness looks like. And no matter how hard the situation is or how much opposition you get, if you do what God asks you to do, you will be rewarded. Maybe not in this life, but at least in the life to come, if not in this life as well. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts or comments you want to add to that, but John. Yeah. Yeah, I'd say Joseph's a pretty good one. Yeah. But I mean, even you think about like Abraham, and Abraham, laid some pretty rotten eggs at points in his life. And obviously David and Solomon and others had some real low points. So Joseph's a good one. I didn't think about Joseph initially when I was thinking about that, but I think Daniel does really stand out in that regard. Yeah. And righteousness doesn't demand perfection. I didn't want to imply that either, but I think he is a pretty pristine example of what righteousness should look like, though. Any other thoughts or questions? All right. Well, I don't want to start Zechariah tonight, so we'll just stop a little bit early. All right. It's good to see everybody. Hope you have a good rest of the week.